Welcome to Bible study number 5. Can't believe that this is our 5th study together in the book of Exodus, but I hope you've been enjoying it. I certainly have been enjoying the studies, and if anything, I've just been blessed by preparing them and doing them. So I hope this is an encouragement to you. As we continue our series in the book of Exodus, today we're going to be looking at the first commandment, commandment number 1 of the 10 commandments. No other gods. You shall have no other gods before me. So let's get into it. Exodus chapter 20. And again, if you want to follow along with some notes, they're in the description below, and you're welcome to do so. Exodus chapter 20 says, "And God spoke all these words, saying, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. You shall have no other gods before me." You know, I remember a couple of years ago at a previous workplace that I worked, it was the end of the day one day, and all the staff, we were gathered in one section of the office there together. And I don't actually know how the conversation came about, but somehow we began to talk about religion. And there was a lady who was sort of describing her belief system, and it was very based upon astrology and, sort of new age type thinking. And I expressed my views as a Christian, which brought pretty strong attack from this lady who thought I was being unscientific and ridiculous for believing that a God created everything and so on. I found it kind of ironic because she was claiming that her whole mood was based upon the position of Jupiter in the sky. But anyway, I didn't get into that. But I remember my boss, who was sitting off to the side, piped up at one point, and she said, I'm an atheist. I think she really kind of meant an agnostic, but she said, I don't believe in God, but, I think that whoever came up with the 10 commandments must have been really intelligent, because there are some really good standards to live by. And, I think that they're really genius. I had a bit of a chuckle to myself because, yes, I agreed with her that whoever came up with them is a genius. But I said to her, well, you know what the first one is, don't you? And she said, no. I said, well, the first commandment is that we are not to have any other gods except for God, the God of the Bible. And I remember her response just made me laugh. She says, okay, well, maybe I don't like them so much anymore. And that was really telling, because it reminded me of just how foundational this first commandment is to not only the rest of the commandments themselves, but also to our entire Christian faith, that we are to worship God exclusively for who he is, because he is the one true and living God. So the first commandment, I am the Lord your God, you shall have no other gods before me, really has to do with our theology, what we believe about God. Everyone in the world has a theology. They have a belief about God. Whether that belief is true is another thing. Not only that, but everybody in the world also has a desire to worship. We are worshipers by nature. Just the very existence of so many religious systems and beliefs reveals to us that in our hearts, we desire to ascribe the nature of godhood or godness, if you would, to something outside of ourselves. Even the most hardened atheist really has to admit that they crave or they worship or they love something which is greater than themselves, whether it be knowledge or science or discovery or whatever it is. They ascribe a value to something which is greater than themselves. This godness, or this desire to do this, to worship, is innate in all of us. In Romans chapter 1, verse 25, explains this very clearly. It says about the depravity of man that we exchanged the truth of God for a lie, and we worshiped and served the creature, or the creation, rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. And so this basically says that we worship one of two things. Either we worship the Creator, or we worship something in the creation. Either God is the object of our worship, or something in creation, or something that we even create in our own minds, is the object of our worship. So why does God put this commandment first? Well, obedience to this commandment is really the founding principle upon which all the others are based. If we get this one wrong, if we miss this one, this feeds all the others. And the fact that there is only one God sets the foundation for all the others. If there's not just one God, then really all the other arguments crumble. So this command really is about who do we worship and who do we know as God. It reveals the exclusivity of God, not just simply the elevation of God. So when it says, you shall have no other gods before me, it doesn't just simply mean that God or Yahweh is the greatest of all the other gods out there, that he's better than the Egyptian gods, or he's better than the Roman gods or the Greek gods or any other gods that were believed to exist at that time. Now, it doesn't mean that he's just simply the greatest of all, so you should worship him more so than Ra or Osiris or the other gods that you worshipped in Egypt, but rather that he is the only God in existence. And therefore, any other god, small g, is merely a product of our own imagination. So we have to, if we are to be true lovers of God, worship him exclusively because there are no other gods. Now, so this commandment teaches us two things. First of all, it teaches us what we call monotheism, or the truth that there is one God. Mono, one, theism, theist, God. There is only one God. So to be a Christian, be a lover of God, a follower of God, means that you must believe there is only one God. So this commandment automatically puts Christianity and even Judaism to some degree outside and on the edges of modern society because it denies this idea of pluralism. The concept of pluralism is really pervasive in our modern secular society, and it's the idea that basically all truth is equally valid. So, Christian truth is just as valid as Islamic truth, and Islamic truth is just as valid as Jewish truth, and Jewish truth is just as valid as pagan truth, and so on and so forth, so that they're all equally valid. They all have value somewhere in them, and then it's up to us as individuals to decide what that value is and what truth we want to uphold and hold on to out of all these different systems. It really puts them all on the same level. But this commandment in of itself, what it's saying, that you shall have no other gods before me, denies this idea of pluralism. And again, God doesn't just simply stand out as better than the rest. He is exclusive. I don't know if you've ever seen one of those, maybe a bumper sticker or a sign, and it's become quite a telling sign of the society that we now live in. The West has, for most, really, in many ways, rejected the Judeo-Christian worldview that it was based upon and has adopted pluralism as its moral and civic foundation. Maybe you've seen the bumper sticker or something that says has the word coexist on it. And each letter represents a different symbol of a different major religion. So you have the C is the crescent moon of Islam. The O is either the yin and the yang or the peace sign. The X is represented by the Star of David of Judaism. The I even has a little dot above it, which is actually, depending on some versions of it, sometimes the sign of the pentagram, which is a satanic symbol. And then, of course, the T is the cross, putting Christianity right on the same level and saying that all of these truths can coexist together because they're all equally valid. That's the world that we live in. So you can see how a love of this commandment and a worship of God exclusively to all others automatically put the Jewish people separated and distinct from the pagan nations around them, and it puts us at the same place. So this commandment to the Jews meant that they were not to add or adopt any other gods or belief systems to try and get them to coexist. They were not to do that. As a matter of fact, they were commanded to do the exact opposite when they went into the land, to rid the land of not only the people who were pagans themselves, but of their entire belief system. They were not to coexist with these things. Now, did they do that? No, they didn't, did they? They intermarried with the daughters of Canaan. They adopted in many ways the pagan worship, and they tried to add Baal worship and Asherah worship into their religious system. And so they very quickly denied this idea and this commandment to worship God exclusively. So this command denies pluralism in the sense that because it teaches monotheism, there is only one God. God will not be put on the same level. He will not be compared to any others. There is only one God. And therefore, all other gods are merely figments of man's wicked imagination. It also destroys moral relativism. If there is only one God, then there is only one lawgiver. Moral relativism and pluralism, the idea that truth is relative and therefore morals are relative, they self-implode in their own arguments. They actually die on their own crosses, because you can't definitively say that all truth is relative, because that itself is not a relative statement. So it actually comes back on itself. You can't say that all truth is equally valid because that itself is a statement of truth, which basically dies on its own sword, because it basically means you can't say that the idea that I say that there's only one truth, you can't say that that's invalid, because it just doesn't work. So they are exclusive statements in themselves. They fall on their own swords, based even just on their own logic and philosophical ideas. But the commandment here that I am the Lord your God, you shall have no other gods before me, reminds us that truth and morality is not relative. It's not based upon our opinion. It's based upon the fact that there is one God and one lawgiver. You see, God has written his law not just in stone here in Exodus chapter 20, but God has actually written these principles into the very fabric of our universe. And no matter how much we try and convince ourselves that we can somehow live by our own truth and make up our own concepts of morality, what we will find is that eventually, when we break the law of God, God's law eventually breaks us. And so, as much as the world has tried to live civil and successful lives and bring in whatever it is it desires through rejection of these truths, it never works. We have enough history to show us that. We have enough empirical evidence to show us that. And of course, most importantly, we have God's word to tell us that. So this command, first of all, teaches monotheism. There's one God. It denies pluralism. It destroys moral relativism. But this commandment also teaches more than just simply a right knowledge of God. It also teaches, and I'm going to sort of make up a word here, or at least I think I'm making up a word, but I really actually haven't. It teaches what I'm going to call monotheism. Now, when I wrote that word down, I thought, oh, this is cool. I'm creating my own word here. And then I realized I actually hadn't created it. There's actually another group which has invented this word called loveism. But it's interesting that it's actually a philosophy developed by pagans to describe a way of life. And it's funny because when I looked it up, it said that this idea of loveism is based upon two fundamental human rights, the right to know truth and the right to love, which I found ironic because it's coming from a group of people who deny that there's any truth. And yet they want to try and live by this philosophy of loveism. And of course, loveism is just simply acceptance of everything. It's based upon that pluralistic idea. So what I'm saying is I'm kind of going to steal that word and put the other term in front of it, one love. Not only is there one God, but this commandment tells us to love God exclusively. You see, it's more to fulfill this commandment. It's more than just simply to agree with the theological concept that there's only one God. and even to agree that that God is the God of the Bible. But this command commands us to love God exclusively, and to love him supremely. You see, the problem with the people of Israel is that they wanted to love God, but they also wanted to love other gods alongside that God. They wanted to bring in other gods into their worship. They didn't want to eliminate the worship of Yahweh. They just simply wanted to add some things to it. Elements of pagan worship, high altars, groves, even some of the idolatry and pagan practices that were part of Baal worship and Asherah worship. Now, when he says you shall have no other gods before me, there's two thoughts around what he's saying here. One, before me could mean that you should have none other but me. That's certainly true. So no other gods but me. Another way of kind of understanding that phrase is that you should bring no other gods before my face. In other words, don't bring any other god or thing of worship in front of me. Don't bring it to me. You know, in a book written by Kevin DeYoung called The Ten Commandments, he gives a really helpful illustration about this and uses marriage as a really good analogy. And I'm going to borrow from his analogy because it just works so well, and I totally agree with it. He said, you know, there are some unions which are exclusive in their very nature, and marriage is one of them. So suppose I come home one day from work and I say to my wife, hey, honey, just want to let you know I love you very much. But I've also met this other lady who I'd like to bring into our home. Now, I love you and I love her, but I love you more than I love her. But I would like to spend some time with her because I like her. Now, I'm going to spend more time with you than I do with her, but I'm just going to bring her in and I want to add her to our relationship. Well, what would her response be? It wouldn't be, and it shouldn't be, oh yeah, that's fine, no problem. I can understand that. As long as I'm more important to you than this other woman, then that's okay. No, that would not and should not be her response, because marriage, by its very nature, is an exclusive relationship. It's an either or. Either I love her exclusively, or I love something else. You can't add anything into it. And isn't that the way that Jesus in the New Testament illustrates our relationship to God? That the church is like the bride of Christ, united to God exclusively through Jesus. Even God, in the way he describes his relationship with Israel, is in many ways, he uses marriage language to describe that kind of relationship as an exclusive union that he has with his people. And so this commandment teaches us not only that God is one, but that he alone is worthy of our love and our devotion. This commandment forms the foundation of all others because a supreme love for God fuels the love for the rest of his law. That should be the motivating factor, which is exactly why Jesus said the greatest commandment is to love God with all of your heart, soul, mind, and strength, because that fuels the rest. Alexander McLaren says this about this law. He says, if we search our hearts with this candle of the Lord, we shall find many an idol set up in their dark corners. So if we take this law and use it to search our hearts, this is what we find. And be startled to discover how much we need to bring ourselves to be judged and condemned by this commandment. It is the foundation of all human duty. Obedience to it is the condition of peace and blessedness, light and leading for mind, heart, will, affections, desires, hopes, fears, and all the world within that longs for one living person, even when it least knows the meaning of its longings and the reason of its unrest. Remember, last week we said that the law's purpose is diagnostic. It's to reveal and diagnose the problem in our hearts. So this law should search our hearts to reveal areas where maybe we have set up or brought in other things of the creation that we are loving in addition to God himself. And it reminds us that there is actually only one person in the entire history of the world who has ever kept this law to perfection. And that is Jesus Christ. And he said, whoever has seen me has seen the Father. You see, our hearts are pulled more to love the creation, things in the creation. And it can be concrete things or abstract things. It can be imaginations of our own mind, our own heart. As a matter of fact, the love of creation is really the core of the cause of breaking all other commandments. You see, if I love material things and possessions, I will covet them and maybe even steal them or lie in order to get them. If I love pleasure more than I love God, I will commit adultery in my heart, in my mind, or maybe even with my body. If I love my own status and my own position and my own pride and my own self more than I love others, I will be angry and murderous in my heart when they upset me or they frustrate me. So you can see how this commandment really forms the foundation. So can I challenge us? When Jesus calls people to follow him, which is to follow Jesus, therefore to follow God, he calls us to forsake all others and to worship and love him exclusively and supremely. So if you find yourself right now, if you're listening to this study and you're thinking to yourself, you know what, I don't like this law, just like my boss said earlier in our lesson at the beginning. You know what, I don't really like this idea that God deserves and demands all of my love and all of my affection. If you find yourself hating what it calls from us, then that's a good indication that your heart is still a heart of stone, that it hasn't been melted by the grace of God. But if this command delights you, if it rings true to you, if you say, I want to do that, I delight in this law, I want to love God exclusively and supremely. And yes, I find in my heart a struggle with idolatry, sinful idolatry in all of its various forms, but I want to love God exclusively and supremely, then that is a good sign to you that grace has come in and that your heart has been melted by the fires of God's grace and that we are motivated by love to worship God exclusively and to love him supremely. So that's commandment 1, no other gods before me. I hope that's an encouragement to you and a blessing to you. And next week we'll be looking at commandment 2, not to make ourselves a carved image in any likeness of things in heaven or things on earth.